The leanto shed on the east gable end of the marsh cabin had been built by Owen's father in 1851 and had stood for 24 years through every Seattle, Washington County winter the Rhode Island hill country could produce. It came down in December of 1875 under the weight of 18 inches of wet snow that accumulated on its low-pitched roof over 3 days of a storm that the Narragansett Bay weather brought in from the southeast, the direction from which the worst Washington County storms always came. Owen was already sick when the shed came down. He had been coughing since October, the kind of cough that started as a nuisance and became by November the kind of thing that a person heard through the floor at night and could not unhear. He came to the door when the shed collapsed and looked at the splayed boards and the wood spread across the yard in the December sleet and said nothing. He was 39 years old, and the shed was beyond his capacity that winter. Abigail said she would manage it. She managed what she could. She and her daughter, Margaret, who was 15, stacked the salvageable wood against the south wall of the house under a tarpaulin weighted with stones. The rest, the pieces that had gone into the mud and the sleet, they left where they were and used them first, burning wet wood through December and January. Owen died in February of 1876. The wetwood winter and the shed on the ground and the cough through the floor were the context of that February. And when the ground thawed in April and she walked the 22 acres of the farm for the first time, with a deliberate eye toward what needed to be done, the woodshed was at the top of the list. She stood in the yard and looked at the east gable end where the leanto had been. The attachment points were still visible, the bolt holes in the gable boards, the ghost of the leanto's roofline on the painted wood. She could rebuild a leanto. Owen's father had built the first one. She had watched Owen repair it twice in their 11 years of marriage and understood the construction. She could build it again. She did not build it again. What she thought about, standing in the April yard looking at the leanto ghost on the east gable, was her grandfather, Ephraim Cook. Ephraim had farmed Washington County his whole life, born in 1789 and died in 1867. And the house he had built in the 1820s on the Cook property, 3 miles north, had been a pier foundation frame house, with board and batten skirting on 3 sides, and a hinged access panel on the south. The crawl space under Ephraim's house had been his root vegetable cellar, his winter potatoes and turnips and carrots in sand bins below the kitchen floor. Dry through every Rhode Island winter, because the house floor above kept the rain out and the skirting kept the ground, moisture, and the wind from reaching the stored food. She had been inside Ephraim's crawl space as a child, helping him retrieve potatoes in January. She had crawled through the hinged panel on the south side and passed the potato bin up to him where he crouched at the access opening. She remembered 2 things about the crawl space. It was dry, drier than the outdoors, even in the wettest January, and it was dark and smelled of earth and the particular cold that was not freezing, never freezing, but was steady and cool and the same in January as it had been in October. Grandfather Ephraim had used the underfloor space for root vegetables. Root vegetables needed specific temperature conditions, above freezing, below 55 degrees, steady humidity. Firewood needed none of those specific conditions. Firewood needed only one thing, to be dry. The house floor above Ephraim's crawl space had kept the rain out. The house floor above her own crawl space would keep the rain out. The crawl space under her own cabin was 20 inches deep, not enough for root vegetables in proper sand bins, but more than enough for split firewood stacked 16 inches high on elevated rails. She had a woodshed already. She had had one since Owen's father built the house in 1851. It was under the cabin, 20 inches deep, running the full 16 by 22 foot footprint of the house, and the rain had not reached it in 25 years because the floor above it was weatherproof and the crawl space had been open to the outside air on all 4 sides, which meant it had also been open to wind-driven moisture, which was why she would need to skirt it. She thought about Thomas Fenwick, who had come in March, a week after Owen's funeral, to offer his opinion that a widow with 3 children might find life easier in Providence, where there was family and work and a community for the children. She had thanked him and said she intended to stay on the farm. He had looked at the collapsed shed material still in the yard and at the south wall tarp pile and had not said anything further. But she had seen his assessment in the look. This is not manageable for a woman alone. She thought about James Marsh, Owen's brother, who had offered in April to take over the farm's management, not purchase it. He had been careful about the word purchase, but manage it. which would have meant his presence and his decisions and his ownership of the work she was doing without a title that reflected it. She thought about what a woodshed visible in the yard meant in a small Washington County community where everyone on the road could see what was stacked against your wall, and where a well-stocked woodpile communicated both sufficiency and availability. A sufficient widow might have surplus to share. An insufficient widow needed help. She was neither insufficient nor interested in sharing, and she had declined James and Thomas on that basis, and she intended to continue declining on that basis. And the best way to decline was to give the community nothing to assess. No woodpile in the yard, no leanto on the east gable, a normally skirted house on its fieldstone piers, the same as any finished house in Washington County, and the winters wood underneath it where the rain could not reach it and Thomas Fenwick could not see it from the road. She began the skirting in May of 1876. The boards were from the collapsed leanto, which had given her more board and batten material than she needed for the skirting and left her a small surplus for other purposes. She nailed vertical boards to the pier faces on the north, east, and west sides of the house, each board cut to fill the gap between the ground and the floor framing above, with a half-inch gap at the bottom to allow drainage when surface water ran under the boards in a downpour, and the top butted tight against the floor framing to exclude wind. She nailed battens over the board joints in the standard fashion. The south side she built differently. The south side faced the road, which meant it was the most visible face, and it was also the access face, the side through which she would load the wood each autumn and unload it each morning through the winter. She fitted the south skirting boards into dado slots, cut into the pier faces at top and bottom, each board dropping into its slot from above, rather than being nailed in place. From outside, the south skirting looked identical to the north, east, and west skirting vertical boards in the same pattern, the same spacing, the same batten over the joints. The difference was invisible. No nail heads on the south face boards, because they were not nailed. They lifted out. She fitted two adjacent boards in the center of the south skirting face, each board 18 inches wide and 19 inches tall, as the removable access section. The remaining boards on the south face she nailed normally. The two central boards had no nails. They dropped into their dado slots from above and rested there by gravity and the slight outward bow of the boards against the slots. To remove them, she lifted each board straight up and out of its slot and set it aside. The opening left was 36 inches wide and 19 inches tall, adequate to pass split wood through horizontally. Adequate for her to slide on her back and pass wood to her daughter who stacked it inside. The 2-inch ventilation gap she cut at the top of the south skirting panel, between the top of the south face boards and the floor framing above, on the reasoning that the south face was protected from rain by the cabin's roof overhang. The south eave extended 18 inches beyond the south wall, and the overhang deflected rain outward from the south skirting face. Wind-driven rain from the north, east or west could reach those skirting faces and enter through any gap, which was why she had sealed those three faces tight at both top and bottom. The south face, sheltered by the overhang, could carry the ventilation gap without rain entry. Air entered through the 2-inch south gap at the top of the south skirting and was drawn through the enclosed crawl space by the pressure differential between the enclosed space and the outside air. The air exited through the small imperfections in the east and west, skirting the tiny gaps where boards cupped slightly, or where the pier face was not perfectly plumb. The movement was slow, perhaps one complete air change every 10 to 12 hours, slow enough to be imperceptible, fast enough to prevent the humidity from stagnating inside the enclosed crawl space. She built the interior cedar rail system in June. 2 parallel rails of 2-inch diameter cedar running the full 22-foot east-west length of the crawl space, each rail resting on 3 flat stone pads, spaced evenly along its length. The rails raised the bottom course of the wood 3 inches above the ground. 3 inches of air under the bottom course opened to the slow airflow through the crawl space. The ground moisture that might otherwise wick up into the wood base had 3 inches of air to cross, which it could not do. She loaded the crawl space in September of 1876 in the way she had thought through during the summer, lying on her back on a canvas sheet, passing split oak and hickory under the south, skirting through the removable board opening to Margaret, who crouched inside the crawl space and stacked the pieces on the cedar rails in parallel rows. Margaret was 15 and small enough to work in the 20-inch space without difficulty. She stacked with the split face outward and bark face toward the north, which was the stacking her mother had told her to use. Split face out for air circulation, bark face to the wall for protection. The 9-year-old Daniel carried the wood from the yard to Abigail's position at the south, skirting in armloads of 4 pieces at a time. Thomas, the 12-year-old, organized the yard pile for efficient passing. The 4 of them loaded 2 cords and 3/4 in 4 afternoons in September. When the last piece was in, Margaret replaced the removable boards from inside, dropping each one into its dado slot from below and pushing it flush with the face of the adjacent fixed boards. From outside, normal skirting. No nail heads on the removable boards, no visible difference from the rest of the south face. She had cut the trapdoor in the kitchen floor in August before loading. A 14 by 16-inch opening in the floorboard run directly above the center of the crawl space, hung on to strap hinges, with a flush ring pull countersunk into the door face so that the ring lay flat when the door was closed. The kitchen rug, a braided oval rug that had been in the kitchen since Owen's mother had made it in the 1860s, covered the trapdoor entirely. The ring pull was below the rug surface, accessible by feel through the rug's weave if you knew to reach for it, invisible if you did not. Thomas Fenwick came in the 2nd week of December 1876. He had come in November 2. On the visit he made each year to the properties on the Richmond Road as a kind of informal welfare check that the Washington County community maintained for its widows and elderly. In November he had noted no outdoor woodpile and no leanto, and had offered to send his son with a cord of wood from the Fenwick supply. Abigail had thanked him and said she had what she needed. He had looked at the farmyard, bare of any woodpile, and had seemed uncertain, and had gone. He came back in December with the same offer, phrased more insistently. The cold was coming, he said, and he would not feel right knowing she had nothing stacked. She said, "I have what I need for the winter." He looked at the yard, no pile. He looked at the east gable end, no leanto. He looked at the south face of the house, the same board and batten skirting as the other 3 sides. Nothing remarkable about it. He said, "Where do you keep it?" She said, "Close by." He did not ask further. He was a polite man, and she had answered him, and he went home and she watched him go from the kitchen window. She then reached under the kitchen rug, found the flush ring pulled by feel, and opened the trapdoor. She passed a morning's worth of split oak, up through the opening to Margaret, who was waiting. Thomas carried it to the stove. Daniel stacked what would not fit in the stove bin against the kitchen wall. The family's wood supply system operated below the floor, invisible from outside, requiring 2 minutes of daily retrieval through the kitchen floor. The wood was dry. December had brought 8 inches of sleet and freezing rain to Washington County, and the outdoor woodpiles of every farm on the Richmond Road had iced over. The split faces sealed with a 1/4-inch glaze that had to be chipped before the wood could be started. Thomas Fenwick's son had spent an hour with a hatchet on their outdoor pile the morning after the sleet. Abigail's wood had no ice. It had been under the house during the sleet event, 20 inches below the kitchen floor, sheltered by the cabin's floor framing above and the board and batten skirting on all 4 sides. The sleet had not reached a single piece. January brought 5 days below 10 degrees. Outdoor woodpiles in Washington County, if they had survived the December sleet without freeze bonding, were now locked in. The pieces that had been stacked with any moisture between them had frozen together in the cold, requiring the hatchet again to separate. Abigail's wood was dry enough that no pieces had bonded. The low humidity in the enclosed crawl space had prevented the moisture film between pieces from accumulating, and the crawl space temperature at 20 inches below the floor had stayed at 38 to 42 degrees. Through the 5-day cold snap, above the point where wood pieces bonded, the children worked the retrieval system without instruction by February. Daniel lifted the kitchen rug each morning. Margaret reached through the trapdoor with both arms and passed up 6 pieces. Thomas stacked them. 3 minutes, no outdoor trip, no ice on the wood, the stove going by the time the morning meal required it. In February, with 6 weeks of winter still ahead, Abigail had slightly more than 1 cord remaining in the crawl space. She had started with 2 cords and 3 cords. She had burned approximately 1 cord and 3/4 through the winter, and had enough for the rest of it with a small surplus. The winter before, with the wet wood from the collapsed shed and the wet yard pile, she had burned 3 cords and come to March barely supplied. The difference was not the quantity of wood. The quantity was approximately the same. The difference was what condition the wood was in when she burned it. Dry wood at 12 to 15% moisture content burned at full efficiency, requiring less wood per unit of heat than wet wood at 30 to 40%. 2 3/4 cords of dry wood had lasted her family through a Washington County winter more comfortably than 3 cords of wet wood had lasted the winter before. She thought about this in February, sitting by the stove with a clean ceiling above it and no ice to chip, and the rug lying flat over the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. She thought about Thomas Fenwick coming in December to offer her wood she did not need, looking at the farmyard with no visible pile, puzzled at the clean yard and the self-sufficient widow, and the answer, close by, was exactly right. The wood was 18 inches below where her feet rested on the kitchen floor. It had been there since September. It would be there until the last week of March, when she would load the south skirting access boards and slide them out and load next autumn's wood, with the children's help, over 4 September afternoons, and replace the boards, and the house would look the same from the road, normally skirted, no woodshed visible, the widow managing fine on her own, which she was. The physics of why the under-cabin woodshed kept the firewood dry through a Washington County, Rhode Island winter that included 8 inches of sleet, 5 days below 10 degrees, and sustained wet conditions from November through March, requires explanation at each stage of the moisture problem that the system addressed. The first and most significant moisture threat was precipitation, rain, sleet, and snow falling directly onto the woodpile. In the previous winter, with the lean-to collapsed and the wood stored under a tarpaulin against the south wall, this was the threat that had done the most damage. The October and November rains had driven under the tarpaulin edges. The sleet in December had penetrated the tarpaulin through the accumulated weight of ice on its surface that broke the tarpaulin slope, and by January, the wood had absorbed moisture from multiple rain events across its full surface area. The cabin floor eliminated this threat entirely and categorically. The floor framing above the crawl space, floor joists, subfloor boards, finish floorboards, was the same weatherproof structure that kept rain out of the cabin interior. A structure that was weatherproof enough to keep rain out of a heated living space was more than adequate to keep rain out of a storage space below it. The floor was not a tarpaulin that could lift in the wind or collect weight until it sagged. It was fixed construction, nailed in place, with the same integrity it had maintained since Owen's father built the house in 1851. The December sleet that had glaze-coated every outdoor woodpile in Washington County had not penetrated the kitchen floor. The second moisture threat was ground-level moisture, the capillary wicking of ground moisture upward through the soil and into the base of any material resting on it. In an open crawl space with no skirting, the ground beneath the cabin was often wetter than the surrounding soil, because the rain falling on the cabin roof drained from the eaves and soaked into the soil at the perimeter of the house. This perimeter moisture moved laterally under the house and kept the undercabin soil at higher moisture content than the surrounding open ground. The cedar rails at 3-inch elevation addressed this threat directly. Wood resting on the rails was separated from the soil by 3 inches of air, which prevented capillary transfer from the ground surface to the wood base. The rails themselves rested on flat stone pads rather than on the soil, which prevented the cedar from absorbing ground moisture and transmitting it upward to the wood above. The third moisture threat was ambient humidity, the high relative humidity of enclosed unventilated spaces in a wet New England winter. A completely sealed crawl space under a heated house would have exchanged its air very slowly with the outside and would have accumulated humidity from the ground moisture and from any moisture already in the wood. High ambient humidity did not wet wood as dramatically as precipitation did, but it prevented drying and could add moisture to wood surfaces over weeks of sustained contact. The twinge ventilation gap at the top of the south skirting managed this threat. The gap was small enough that it did not compromise the temperature stability of the enclosed space or admit wind-driven moisture from the sheltered south face, but it was large enough to allow the slow air exchange that carried the accumulated humidity out of the crawl space and replaced it with the slightly drier air from outside. In a Rhode Island winter, the outside air at 10 degrees was very dry. Cold air holds very little moisture, and even at the higher winter temperatures of 30 to 40 degrees, the outside air in the January-February period was drier than the pat, enclosed crawl space air that had been in contact with the soil and the wood for weeks. The combination of the three protections, precipitation, exclusion by the floor, elevation by the cedar rails, humidity management by the south ventilation gap, produced wood storage conditions that were consistently drier than any outdoor or lean-to storage arrangement. The December sleet that had frozen outdoor piles into ice-bonded masses had not reached the under-cabin wood. The January cold snap that had made frozen moisture bonding worse outdoors had not produced bonding in the crawl space because the low humidity there had prevented the moisture film between pieces from accumulating in the first place. The decision to make the access section of the south skirting removable rather than hinged, the design choice that made the woodshed genuinely hidden rather than merely enclosed, reflected Abigail Marsh's specific understanding of the social visibility of her farm in the Washington County community. A hinged access panel on the south skirting would have been visible as a door. The hinge hardware would have been visible. The door gap around the edges would have been visible in the right light, and a person looking closely at the south skirting would have seen that one section opened while the others did not. The hinged panel was the approach her grandfather Ephraim had used. Because Ephraim had not been trying to hide anything, he had been trying to access his root vegetable storage conveniently. He had not minded that a visitor could see the hinged panel and know that the crawl space was used for storage. Abigail minded not from shame about the under-cabin woodshed, which she had no reason to be ashamed of, but from the specific social dynamic of her situation in the Richmond Road community. Thomas Fenwick's check-in visits, James Marsh's management offer, the general knowledge that a widow with 3 children and a farm needed to be assessed for sufficiency. All of this meant that the farm's apparent condition was constantly being evaluated by the community around it. The apparent condition of a farm included its woodshed. A normal farmhouse with a visible woodshed or a well-stocked outdoor pile communicated, "This farm is producing and storing adequately." A normal farmhouse with no visible woodshed and a bare yard communicated, either this farm is not producing, or the widow is buying which she can barely afford, or something is being managed in a way that is not visible. The last of these was what Abigail was communicating, and she was communicating it deliberately. The dado slots for the removable boards required more preparation time than hinge hardware, but left no visible trace on the finished skirting face. She cut the dado slot channels into the pier faces with the tenon saw and chisel, a precise operation that required measuring carefully, because the slots had to be plumb and parallel to receive the boards cleanly, and she could not adjust the slots after the other skirting boards were in place. She tested the fit of each removable board before completing the adjacent fixed boards, dropping each removable board into its slot and checking that it seated without binding and without rattling. The boards she cut for the removable section were from the same batch of lumber as the fixed skirting boards, the same thickness, the same width, the same surface weathering from the years the boards had spent as lean-to sheathing before the lean-to collapsed. This material continuity was the final element of the invisibility. New lumber in the removable section would have been visibly lighter in color than the weathered fixed boards, marking the removable section as a later addition. Using the same salvaged lean-to boards throughout meant the entire south skirting face had the same weathered tone. She had also been careful about the battens. On the fixed sections of all 4 skirting faces, the battens were nailed through the board joints in the normal manner. On the removable section of the south face, she cut the battens to the exact length of the 2 removable boards and pressed them into slightly undersized dado slots cut into the board face. The battens were friction fitted into the boards rather than nailed, and came out with the boards when the boards were removed. A visitor examining the south skirting face would see battens at consistent spacing, nails at consistent positions, weathered boards of consistent color. The removable section was indistinguishable from the fixed sections unless one reached out and tried to lift a board and found that it moved. Thomas Fenwick, in his December visit, had stood at the south skirting face and looked at it. He had looked for long enough that Abigail, watching from the kitchen window, had wondered if he would reach out and test a board. He had not. He had looked at the consistent surface of the skirting face and seen normal skirting, and he had turned away and offered his wood, and she had said, "Close by." The children's role in the under-cabin woodshed system was the aspect of the construction that most clearly distinguished this innovation from all prior innovations in the series. Because every prior innovation had been designed by and for an individual working alone. Abigail Marsh had not designed the under-cabin woodshed with the children in mind. She had designed it as a solution to the firewood dryness problem, and the design had made the solution accessible without outdoor work in bad weather. And she had recognized only during the summer construction that the trapdoor system in the kitchen floor would allow the children to manage the daily wood retrieval without her direct involvement. Margaret, at 15, was strong enough to work in the 20-inch crawl space and had the judgment to stack wood correctly, split face out, bark face in, the rows tight enough that pieces would not fall, but with the half-inch gap between rows that allowed air to reach all faces. She had learned the stacking from the September loading work, when Abigail had directed from outside the south access, while Margaret stacked inside. By the end of the fall loading afternoons, Margaret was directing herself, making the decisions about which pieces to place where and how tight to pack each row. Thomas, at 12, could carry 4 pieces at a time, from the yard to Abigail's position at the south access opening. He developed an efficient grip, 2 pieces in each hand, balanced against his torso, that allowed him to make the trip in about 20 seconds and deliver a row's worth of wood in 2 trips. Over the 4 September loading afternoons, Thomas carried approximately 3,000 pieces of split wood from the yard to the access opening. He did not complain about this work. He was 12, and the work was clear and had a visible end. Daniel, at 9, was too small to carry more than 1 piece at a time, but he organized the yard pile for efficient passing, sorting the pieces by size and placing the larger pieces in a position where they would be loaded last, into the crawl space section closest to the access opening, which was the section farthest from the kitchen trapdoor and therefore the last to be retrieved. The sequential loading matched the sequential retrieval. The pieces stored farthest from the trapdoor were loaded last and would be retrieved last. In the spring, when the pieces stored closest to the trapdoor had been used, Daniel had worked this out himself. Abigail had not told him to organize the pile by size or to think about the retrieval sequence. He had watched Margaret stacking inside and had asked, "Does it matter where in the crawl space each piece goes?" Abigail had said, "The pieces near the trapdoor will be used first." Daniel had then sorted the yard pile so that the largest pieces, which burned longest and were most valuable for overnight fires, were at the back of the pile and would be loaded into the far sections of the crawl space, farthest from the trapdoor, where they would be retrieved last in the deepest cold of February, when the overnight fires mattered most. A 9-year-old had optimized the loading sequence for winter fire management. Abigail watched this from outside the south access opening, passing wood in, and did not say anything about it, because it was correct and there was nothing useful to add. She had built the system. The children had understood it and extended it in the direction of greater efficiency without being instructed to. The daily retrieval system that developed through the winter was similarly emergent. The original plan had been that Abigail would open the kitchen trap door each morning and retrieve the day's wood. By November this had become Margaret's task. She woke first, lifted the kitchen rug, opened the trap door by the ring pull, reached in with both arms and passed up 6 pieces to Thomas, who stacked them beside the stove. By December Daniel had added to this. He carried the morning's ashes from the stove to the ash bin on the porch, while Thomas carried the wood in, so that both tasks were done before the morning meal. By January, the 3 children were managing the morning stove operation without Abigail's involvement. Margaret retrieved, Thomas carried, Daniel cleared the ash, and the stove was going and the kitchen was warm before Abigail came down. She had built the under-cabin woodshed to keep the firewood dry all winter. The children had built from it a family system for winter mornings that would continue for every winter they were on the farm. The economic comparison between the winter of 1875 to 76, with the collapsed leanto, the wet wood, and Owen dying in February, and the winter of 1876 to 77, with the under-cabin woodshed, was the most direct measure of what the construction had accomplished in material terms. In 1875 to 76, 3 cords of wood loaded in the fall, approximately 2/3 of it wet from rain penetration and the December sleet. The wet wood burned at 30 to 40% greater fuel consumption per unit of heat than dry wood. Effective heat output, approximately the equivalent of 2 cords of dry wood at full efficiency, rather than 3. The winter's heating requirement was approximately 2.5 cords of dry wood equivalent. She had come to March short, burning the furniture of the spare bedroom in the last 2 weeks, not for survival, as Vera Nolan in Idaho had burned furniture in 1874, but because the furniture was the only wood available and the weather had not yet permitted outdoor cutting. In 1876 to 77, 2 cords and 3/4 of dry wood loaded in September, burned at full efficiency throughout. The first cord through December and January, the second cord through February, the remaining 3/4 cord through March and into early April. She had enough for the full winter and a surplus to begin the following autumn with. She had not burned any furniture. She had not needed to ask anyone for wood. The cost difference. The leanto's annual requirement was 3 cords of wood, with a wetwood efficiency penalty, equivalent to 4 cords of dry wood, needed but 3 available, leaving a 1/4 cord shortfall. The under-cabin woodshed's requirement was 2 3/4 cords of dry wood, with no efficiency penalty, leaving a 1/4 cord surplus. From a 1/4 cord shortfall to a 1/4 cord surplus, a 1/2 cord improvement, on a farm whose wood supply was the margin between a warm winter and a cold one. At Washington County prices for split hardwood in 1876, a cord of seasoned hardwood was approximately $2.75 delivered. The 1/2 cord improvement represented approximately $1.40 in annual wood cost reduction, plus the elimination of the furniture burning, which she had not priced but which she intended to prevent from happening again. The construction cost of the under-cabin woodshed. The skirting boards came from the collapsed leanto at no cash cost. The dado slot chisel work required her time, not cash. The cedar rails came from a fallen cedar on the property's upper field. The strap hinges and ring pull for the kitchen trapdoor cost 38 cents at the Richmond Hardware. Total cash outlay, 38 cents. Recovery of construction cost in reduced wood expenditure, approximately 4 months. The system was then essentially free, producing the 1/2 cord improvement annually for every subsequent winter. Abigail Marsh farmed the Richmond Road property. She farmed it for 19 more years, until 1895, when Margaret's husband purchased the property and built a proper attached woodshed on the east gable end, the same location as Owen's father's. Original lean-to and the undercabin woodshed was no longer needed because the new attached structure was adequate and weatherproof. Margaret's husband had not known about the undercabin woodshed when he purchased the property. He had been told by Thomas, who had been managing the farm since 1889, when Abigail's health had made the daily work too much. Thomas had lifted the kitchen rug and opened the trapdoor and shown his brother-in-law the cedar rail system in the crawl space, the dado slot access boards in the south skirting, the tinch ventilation gap at the top of the south face. The brother-in-law had looked at it for a long time. He had said, "She built this from the collapsed leanto boards." Thomas had said, "She built it so no one would know it was there." The brother-in-law had looked at the south skirting from outside, normal board and batten, nothing unusual, no indication that the boards moved. He had reached out and lifted one. It came out of its dado slot cleanly, the friction-fitted batten still attached. He said, "I walked past this face every time I came to call on Margaret for 2 years." He said, "I never saw it." Thomas said, "No one did." The specific social context of Washington County, Rhode Island in 1876, the small farm community near the village of Richmond, the density of neighbor observation, the particular position of a widow with children who had declined offers of help, shaped the design of the undercabin woodshed in ways that distinguished it from every other storage innovation in the series. Most prior innovations had been designed to solve a physical problem: wet wood, frozen food, blizzard inaccessibility, inadequate insulation. The design parameters were physical: temperature, moisture, access. The solutions were engineering responses to physical conditions. The undercabin woodshed was designed to solve a physical problem, wet firewood, and a social problem. Simultaneously, the visibility of the farms would supply to a community that treated that visibility as information about the widow's status and needs. This dual design requirement was specific to Abigail's situation. She was not hiding the woodshed from thieves, as Solomon Good in South Carolina had reasons to hide his storage room from hostile observation. She was hiding it from people who meant her well, but whose well-meaning manifested as pressure toward dependence. Thomas Fenwick's wood offer was genuinely kind. James Marsh's management offer was genuinely motivated by concern for his brother's family. Neither of them was malicious. Both of them were operating on the assumption that a widow with 3 children and a collapsed lean-to and a bare farmyard needed intervention. She did not need intervention. She needed a woodshed that did not look like a woodshed. The Rhode Island farming community of 1876 had specific norms about what a well-managed farm looked like from the road. A properly managed farm had a woodshed or a stacked outdoor pile visible from the road in autumn, evidence that the winter's fuel had been secured. A farm without visible wood in late autumn communicated inadequacy, which in turn invited the community's assistance. The community's assistance, in the specific social form it took for a widow who had declined previous offers, meant renewed pressure toward the options she had already refused. The invisible woodshed was her answer to the community's information system. By removing the visible woodpile and the visible woodshed from the road-facing view of the farm, she removed the data point that the community was using to assess her situation. Thomas Fenwick's December visit, and his puzzled look at the bare farmyard, and his question, "Where do you keep it?" and her answer, "Close by," was the specific interaction the invisible woodshed had been designed to produce. He did not know where she kept it. He could not see it. He accepted her answer and went home, and the wood remained under the house, dry and sufficient, invisible from the road. This was the social function of the hidden element, not security against theft, but privacy against assessment. In a community where a widow's farm was everyone's information, she had made one piece of information the state of her would supply unavailable. She had used the same construction that would have been visible if built with hinges, and made it invisible by using dido slots and salvaged boards of matching weathered tone. The social problem and the physical problem had the same solution: the cabin floor as the woodshed roof, the south skirting as the woodshed wall, the dado slot removable boards as the invisible door. The wood was dry because the cabin floor was weatherproof. The wood was hidden because the skirting looked like normal construction. Both conditions were produced by the same structure. She had built one thing and solved two problems with it. This was the specific economy of the design that made it different from every prior innovation in the series. Not the simplest solution to a single problem, but the single solution that addressed both problems in the same construction. The comparison between Abigail Marsh's under-cabin, woodshed, and Prudence Alcott's underfloor firewood trapdoor in Connecticut, the two innovations in the series that most resembled each other on the surface, reveals why they were solving entirely different problems with superficially similar structures. Prudence Alcott, in Connecticut, in 1873, had cut a trapdoor in her hearthside floor and deepened the crawl space below it to approximately 30 inches. She had filled this deepened space with one cord of split firewood as a secondary reserve. The problem she had solved was access. In the January 1875 blizzard that deposited 48 inches of snow, her outdoor woodpile was buried and unreachable. The underfloor reserve was accessible without going outside, and provided 3 days of supply until the blizzard ended and the outdoor pile could be dug out. Her wood had been dry, the outdoor pile had been properly stored under a tarp, and the access in a blizzard was the sole function of her underfloor reserve. Abigail Marsh in Rhode Island in 1876 had built a skirted under-cabin system with removable board access and cedar rail elevation to store the full winter's supply, 2 3/4 cords rather than 1 cord, in conditions that kept the wood dry throughout the season. The problem she solved was moisture. Her previous winter's wood had been wet from a collapsed lean-to, and wet wood, burning at 30 to 40% reduced efficiency, had forced her to burn furniture in March. Her under-cabin woodshed was the primary firewood storage, not a reserve. Its function was dryness throughout the winter, not emergency access in a blizzard. The physical similarity would stored under a floor concealed different problems, 2 different designs, and 2 different mechanisms. Prudence Alcott's design prioritized access in extreme weather over any other consideration. Abigail Marsh's design prioritized moisture, exclusion, and capacity, the full winter's supply, not a 3-day reserve over any other consideration. The access design reflected this difference. Prudence Alcott's single trapdoor was designed for frequent emergency access. She needed to reach it quickly in a blizzard, and the trapdoor in the floor was the fastest possible access. Abigail Marsh's system had 2 access points with different functions: the south skirting removable boards for bulk loading in September, and the kitchen trapdoor for daily retrieval through the winter. The loading and retrieval functions were separated because they had different requirements. The south skirting access needed to pass large volumes of wood quickly in September, while the kitchen trapdoor needed to pass small daily quantities conveniently through the winter. The ventilation design also reflected different priorities. Prudence Alcott's underfloor firewood space was not specifically ventilated. She was not concerned about wood drying in a 3-inch crawl space that had been occupied by firewood for 3 months. Abigail Marsh's under-cabin woodshed included a tinch ventilation gap, specifically to manage the ambient humidity in an enclosed space that would hold wood for 5 to 6 months. The longer storage period and the Rhode Island winter's higher humidity required active ventilation management. The shorter storage period in the Connecticut script did not. Both women had used the cabin floor as the woodshed roof. They had arrived at this realization independently, in different states, in response to different problems, and had built systems that shared a fundamental principle but had almost no design elements in common, except the floor above and the wood below. The ventilation gap's specific position at the top of the south, skirting rather than at the bottom, or on the north, east, or west faces, was a design decision that reflected Abigail's understanding of the Rhode Island winter's moisture sources and wind directions. The prevailing winter winds in Washington County, Rhode Island, came from the southwest and west, the standard northeast corridor pattern, modified by the Narragansett Bay's influence on local weather. Wind-driven rain arrived primarily from the southwest and west. The north and east faces of the skirting faced the directions from which the heaviest rain came in the spring, nor'easters, but the southwest was the source of the standard winter rain and sleet. A ventilation gap at the bottom of any skirting face would admit ground-level moisture, the rain splash from the perimeter soil and the surface, runoff during heavy rain, directly into the enclosed crawl space. A gap at the top of the north, east, or west faces would admit wind-driven moisture during the southwest storms. A gap at the top of the south face, sheltered by the 18-inch south roof overhang, admitted air but no rain. The overhang deflected south face rain outward before it could reach the gap position. This was the specific geometry of the problem that made the south face top gap the only correct position for the ventilation opening. The gap needed to admit air without admitting moisture, which meant the gap needed to be at a position that the weather could not reach directly. The south overhang provided a shelter zone approximately 12 inches wide at the skirting face level, a zone in which wind-driven rain from any direction was blocked by either the overhang above or the adjacent skirting boards on the sides. The tinch gap cut within this shelter zone admitted air from the still air space between the overhang and the skirting face. The direction of air movement through the gap inward at the bottom, outward at the top, was the result of the temperature differential between the enclosed crawl space and the outside air. The crawl space air, slightly warmed by the floor above it and the ground below it, rose toward the top of the enclosed space and exited through the highest available opening, the tinch south gap. Cooler outside air entered through the smallest available openings in the other 3 skirting faces, the unavoidable imperfections in the board and batten construction. This movement was slow, one air change every 10 to 12 hours at the typical winter wind conditions, but it was consistent and continuous. The air inside the crawl space was never fully stagnant. The slow replacement of humid enclosed air with the drier outside air in winter was sufficient to prevent the humidity buildup that would otherwise have promoted surface moisture on the stored wood. Abigail had not derived this from physics texts or engineering principles. She had derived it from her grandfather Ephraim's observation. The crawl space under his house had always been dry, even in the wettest Rhode Island winters, and from her own observation of where water came from in a Rhode Island winter storm. Rain came from the southwest, sleet came from the east. The north face was sheltered by the barn 40 feet away. The south face was sheltered by the overhang. She put the gap where the overhang protected it. The principle was the same one that appeared throughout this series under different names in different contexts. Identify where the weather comes from. Design the opening where the weather cannot reach. Clara Voss in New Jersey had identified the southeast cave mouth as sheltered from the northwest rain and built her platform inside the sheltered face. Vera Nolan in Idaho had identified the south-facing hillside as the correct location for the survival room entrance and had used the South Hill's reduced wind exposure. Abigail Marsh had identified the south overhang as the rain-sheltered face and had put the ventilation gap there. The specific form of each shelter was different: a geological cave mouth, a hillside orientation, an architectural overhang. The principle was identical: put the opening where the weather does not reach. The instruction Abigail wrote for her daughter, Margaret, in the autumn of 1879, when Margaret was 17 and Abigail was teaching her the full management of the farm. against the possibility of Abigail's illness or absence, was the most domestic of the instruction papers in the series, addressed to a specific person who already knew most of what it contained. The paper ran to 1.5 pages in Abigail's handwriting in a household account book, inserted between the October 1878 and November 1878 entries, as if it were itself an account of work performed. It was addressed as a note rather than a formal instruction. Margaret, these are the things you should know about the wood system if you are managing it alone. The loading section. The south skirting boards come out of the dado slots by lifting straight up. Do not pry them outward, they will split. The lower board comes out first, then the upper board. When replacing them, the upper board goes in first, seated in the upper slot, then the lower board, dropped into the lower slot. They must go in this order, because the upper board cannot be lifted past the lower board if the lower board is already in the slot. This is the mistake I made the first time I replaced them and had to remove the lower board and start over. The stacking section, split face outward always, because the split face is the face the wood breathes through. Bark face toward the walls or toward the adjacent row. Half-inch gap between rows, not more. More than half an inch, and pieces fall sideways in January when they shrink slightly in the cold. The cedar rails must be clear at both ends. Do not stack wood against the east or west, skirting so tightly that the rail ends are blocked, because the air needs to move under the bottom course along the full length of the rail. The retrieval section. The ring pull is under the southeast corner of the kitchen rug. Reach through the rugs, weave. If you cannot see it, it is always in the same position. 6 pieces for a normal day's fire, 8 pieces if the night will be very cold. Do not take from the far sections until the near sections are empty. The far sections have the largest pieces, which should be saved for the deepest cold. The ventilation section. Check the south gap in October to confirm it is clear. Sometimes a spider builds a web across the gap by September and blocks it. Clear it with a stick if blocked. The gap is at the top of the south skirting face, 2 inches tall, running the full width of the removable board section. The Margaret note was not circulated beyond the household, and was not the basis for any neighbor's construction. It was a mother's instruction to a daughter who would manage the system after her, specific to the specific house and the specific construction that they both knew by touch. 17 women and 1 man on the Richmond Road and its adjacent farms built skirted under cabin woodsheds between 1880 and 1895, all derived from Abigail's system through Anna Corey's account at the Washington County Women's Agricultural Society in 1879. Anna Corey had been shown the system by Abigail in the winter of 1877, had noted the dado slot invisible access and the cedar rail elevation and the south gap ventilation, and had described it at the society meeting in March 1879 without Abigail's knowledge. Abigail had been ill that winter and had not attended. The description Anna gave at the society meeting included the social rationale. The woodshed is invisible from the road because the skirting looks like normal construction. Anna had said this as a practical advantage. The woodshed did not require a separate structure that took up yard space, but the women at the meeting had understood the social dimension immediately, several of them having had their own experiences with neighbors whose assessments of their wood supply had come with attached opinions about their management. The Washington County Women's Agricultural Society recorded the technique in its 1879 minutes as the underfloor wood store method, crediting Abigail Marsh as originator. The minutes noted, the house floor serves as the woodshed roof, eliminating the need for a separate structure and rendering the stored wood invisible from the road. The wood remains dry throughout the season regardless of rain, sleet, or ice events above. Abigail Marsh had not known her name was in the minutes until Margaret showed her the Society's 1879 report in the spring of 1880. She read the entry. She said, "I did not tell Anna to tell the meeting." Margaret said, "Anna thought it should be known." Abigail folded the report and set it on the table. She said, "It should have been known from the beginning. There was no reason to hide the system from anyone, only the wood inside it. Close by, the wood was always close by.